For more than 40 years, investigators carried a secret that refused to give them an answer. They had the evidence, they had DNA collected from crime scenes, they had survivors who remembered details no one else could explain. They had investigators who spent years following leads that went nowhere. They had families who waited decades for a name. But the one thing they did not have was the person behind the evidence. A face, an identity, a suspect. The case remained frozen in time. The DNA could prove that the same person was connected to multiple crimes. It could tell investigators that one unknown offender had left the same biological signature behind, but it could not tell them who he was. Then science changed the rules. A method that had never been used like this before began turning distant relatives into investigative clues. A DNA profile became a family tree. A family tree became a list of possible names, and one name slowly moved closer than the others. Joseph James DeAngelo. For decades, he had lived an ordinary-looking life in California. He had worked as a police officer, he had raised a family, he had grown older while investigators continued searching for answers. But in 2018, a breakthrough happened that changed everything. The DNA that had waited for more than 40 years finally had somewhere to lead. And when investigators followed that path, they discovered that the man they were looking for had been hiding in plain sight. This is the story of how one DNA discovery reopened a forgotten investigation, changed the future of cold cases, and finally gave survivors the answer they had been waiting for. But the DNA breakthrough did not begin with Joseph James DeAngelo. It began with the victims, the people whose lives were changed long before investigators ever knew his name. But the DNA breakthrough did not begin with Joseph James DeAngelo. It began with the victims, the people whose lives were changed long before investigators ever knew his name. For them, this case was not a nickname. It was not a headline. It was not a mystery told years later by people far away from the fear. It was survival. It was grief. It was families waiting for answers. It was people locking doors, checking windows, listening for sounds at night, and wondering whether the person responsible would ever be found. Across California, from the 1970s into the 1980s, communities were being connected by a series of crimes that investigators did not fully understand at first. Different places had different names. In one area, the person was known as the Visalia ransacker. In another, the East Area rapist. Later, the original Night Stalker. And eventually, the Golden State Killer. Each name represented a different stage of the same long search. But at the time, not everyone knew these cases were connected. That is one of the reasons the investigation became so difficult. The crimes were spread across different cities, different counties, different police departments, different files, different investigators, different witnesses, and different years. At first, investigators had pieces, then they had patterns, then they had evidence that suggested the pieces belonged together. But what they still did not have was a name. The early crimes included burglaries, homes were entered, personal items were taken, communities were unsettled. Then the attacks escalated. Survivors described a person who appeared prepared, controlled, and familiar with how to move through neighborhoods without being caught. The fear spread because people did not know who he was. Was he a stranger passing through? Was he someone local? Was he watching homes before choosing them? Was he learning routines? Those questions stayed with people long after the police left their streets. Investigators collected statements. They compared reports. They looked at timing. They studied movement. They followed tips. They eliminated suspects. And still, the person behind the crimes stayed out of reach. As the years passed, the case moved into another stage. The crimes connected to the original Night Stalker involved murders in Southern California. Families lost loved ones, communities changed, and investigators were left with the same painful problem. They had evidence. They had surviving witnesses. They had patterns. They had crime scenes. But they did not have the person. That is what made the case so heavy. The man they were looking for was not only escaping arrest, he was escaping identity. Without a name, investigators could not build a final case. Without a name, survivors had no face to attach to what happened. Without a name, families were left with the hardest kind of question. Who did this? For decades, that question remained unanswered. But evidence had been preserved. That matters. Because in cold cases, preservation can become the difference between silence and a breakthrough. An investigator collecting evidence in the 1970s or 1980s could not know exactly what future science would make possible. They could not know that decades later, DNA technology would become strong enough to use old biological evidence in new ways. They could not know that one day, a profile with no name might be compared against genetic relatives. But some evidence survived, and because it survived, the case survived with it. DNA testing eventually helped investigators connect crimes that had once been treated as separate. The DNA could show that one unknown offender was connected to multiple scenes. That was important. It confirmed links. It strengthened the idea that different names and different regions were part of one larger case. But even then, the DNA still had a limit. It could connect scenes. It could eliminate innocent people. It could confirm that investigators were dealing with the same offender. But it could not automatically say Joseph James DeAngelo. For years, the DNA was powerful but unfinished. It was evidence without an identity, a signature without a face, a voice without a name. And that is where the case remained. A long investigation, old evidence, families waiting, survivors aging, investigators retiring, files growing thicker, leads fading, and still no final answer. Then a new method began to change what investigators believed was possible: investigative genetic genealogy. The idea sounds simple at first, but it changed everything. Investigators were no longer only asking whether the killer's DNA was already inside a criminal database. They were asking whether the DNA could lead them to relatives, distant relatives, people connected through family lines, people who might not know anything about the crimes, people who might have uploaded genetic information for ancestry research, family history, or personal curiosity. The investigators were not looking for the name first. They were looking for the family. If they could find people genetically connected to the unknown DNA, they could begin building family trees. They could go backward, then forward. They could study branches. They could look at marriages, births, locations, ages, and possible family connections. They could ask a new question. Who in this family tree could have been in the right places at the right times and fit the evidence? The DNA did not point straight to a door. It pointed to a family tree. And that family tree became a map, not a simple map, not a quick map, a complicated one, full of names, generations, branches, possible connections, wrong turns, eliminations, and careful comparisons. Investigators had to work through possibilities one by one. A person might match the family line but be too young. Another might be too old. Another might live too far away. Another might have no connection to the crime locations. Another could be ruled out by direct DNA. The process narrowed the field, slowly, carefully, until one name began to stand out. Joseph James DeAngelo. He was living in Citrus Heights, California. He was older now. He had a home, a family, a regular-looking life. But his background carried a detail that shocked many people when it became public. He had once worked in law enforcement. DeAngelo had served as a police officer in Exeter, California. Then he served as a police officer in Auburn, California. That detail did not prove guilt by itself. But once investigators were already looking at him through the DNA genealogy work, it made them pay close attention. A former police officer would have understood patrol patterns, police response, evidence, victim statements, how investigations worked, how suspicion moved, how to avoid certain mistakes. For families and survivors, that detail made the arrest feel even harder to process. The person investigators had been searching for had once been part of the system people trusted to protect them. But a name was not enough. Genetic genealogy gave investigators a direction. It did not finish the case. Before an arrest, they needed direct confirmation. They needed DeAngelo's DNA, not from a family tree, not from a relative, from him. So investigators watched, they waited, and then they collected DNA from items he discarded, something ordinary, something thrown away, something he likely never expected to matter. That discarded DNA was compared to the old crime scene DNA, and the result gave investigators what they had been waiting for across 4 decades: a match. Think about the weight of that moment. For years, the case had been a file, a name no one knew, evidence waiting in storage, survivors asking if the person would ever be found, families wondering if they would die without answers. and then one discarded sample connected the past to the present. The old evidence had finally found a living man. On April 24, 2018, Joseph James DeAngelo was arrested. He was 72 years old. He was taken into custody in Citrus Heights. For the public, it was a breaking news story. For investigators, it was the result of decades of work. For survivors and families, it was something much more personal. The unknown man had a name. After all those years, the person connected to the DNA was no longer a shadow in a case file. He was Joseph James DeAngelo. But even then, the story was not finished. An arrest is not the same as justice. The next test would come in court. And this case was not simple. The crime stretched across years and counties. Some evidence was old, some victims had died, some survivors had waited decades. Some charges could not be brought because too much time had passed. But prosecutors still built a case that crossed California, a case that required coordination, a case that had to account for the full scale of harm. In 2020, Joseph James DeAngelo pleaded guilty. He pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder. He also admitted to many additional uncharged crimes as part of a plea agreement. In court, the case became more than a list of charges. It became a record of lives damaged across California. Contra Costa County reported that DeAngelo admitted committing crimes against 87 individual victims across 53 crime scenes. Those numbers are heavy, but even those numbers cannot fully hold the human cost. Each number was a person, a family, a home, a memory, a life changed. And during sentencing, survivors and family members finally had the chance to speak. For some, it was the first time they could speak directly in the presence of the man responsible. For others, it was a moment they had waited for across most of their lives. They spoke about fear, loss, pain, years stolen, families broken, lives reshaped, and the long wait for a name. That is why this case cannot be told only as a forensic success story. Yes, the DNA breakthrough changed the investigation. Yes, genetic genealogy made the arrest possible. Yes, the science mattered. But behind the science were people who carried the case long before technology caught up. Survivors who kept living, families who kept waiting, investigators who kept evidence alive. DeAngelo was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He will not be released. But for many people affected, no sentence could undo what had happened. The courtroom gave them a legal ending. It did not return what had been taken. Still, the sentencing mattered. Because after decades of uncertainty, the case finally had a name, a conviction, and a punishment. That is the legal ending. But the larger impact of the case reached far beyond one courtroom. The Golden State Killer case changed how people understood cold case investigations. Before this breakthrough, many old cases seemed almost impossible to move forward. If traditional DNA databases did not produce a match, investigators often had nowhere else to go. But this case showed that a DNA profile could still have a path through relatives, a path through genealogy, a path through public records, a path through patient reconstruction of family history. Suddenly, old evidence in storage rooms across the country felt different. It was not just old evidence, it was waiting evidence. Evidence that might become useful when the right technology arrived. Evidence that could speak years later. Evidence that could bring a case back from silence. That is why this DNA break changed everything. It showed investigators that time does not always erase the truth. Sometimes time only delays it. Sometimes the evidence is still there. Sometimes it needs a new method, a new question, a new way to search. And after DeAngelo's arrest, genetic genealogy became one of the most discussed tools in modern cold case work. Other cases began receiving new attention. Families began asking whether old DNA could be tested again. Investigators began looking at evidence with fresh possibilities. But the breakthrough also raised serious questions. Because genetic genealogy does not only involve suspects, it can involve relatives. People who may have uploaded DNA for ancestry research. People who may not realize their genetic information could help identify a distant family member in a criminal investigation. That opened a national conversation. When should police be allowed to use genealogy data? What rules should protect privacy? How should consent work? Should violent crimes be treated differently? What about cases that are not murders? What about the rights of people who never committed any crime, but whose DNA helps point investigators towards someone else? These questions matter. They do not erase the importance of solving serious crimes, but they do remind us that powerful tools need careful rules. The DNA break gave answers. It also forced society to think about how those answers are found. That is part of the legacy of the Golden State Killer case. It is both a story of justice and a story of modern forensic power, a story of old evidence becoming new evidence, a story of science reaching backward into the past, a story of a man identified not because he was already in a criminal database, but because his genetic relatives helped form a map. And in the end, the breakthrough did not come from one dramatic moment. It came from many quiet decisions, evidence preserved, cases reviewed, DNA tested, genealogy searched, family trees built, suspects eliminated, a name selected, surveillance conducted, discarded DNA collected, a match confirmed, an arrest made, a courtroom filled, survivors heard, a sentence given. That is how cold cases often change. Not all at once, step by step, detail by detail, until the missing piece finally appears. For more than 40 years, the Golden State Killer case waited for that missing piece. The DNA was there, the science was not ready. Then the science changed. And when it did, the case changed with it. Joseph James DeAngelo had lived for decades without being named publicly as the man behind those crimes. But the evidence had not forgotten. The DNA had not disappeared, the cases had not truly closed, and the people affected had not stopped deserving answers. That is the power of this case. It reminds us that a cold case is not always dead. Sometimes it is waiting for one test, one database, one investigator, one preserved sample, one family tree, one discarded item, one breakthrough. Before you leave, think about the detail that stands out most. Was it the preserved DNA that waited for decades? Was it the genealogy search that found relatives before it found the suspect? Was it the fact that Joseph James DeAngelo had once worked in law enforcement? Was it the discarded sample that confirmed the match? Or was it the courtroom moment when survivors and families finally had the chance to speak? Tell me in the comments which part of this case changed how you see cold case investigations. And if you want more true crime documentaries told with careful research, real names, strong timelines, and respect for victims and survivors, subscribe to the channel. No rushed conclusions, no careless storytelling, no empty shock, just real cases, real evidence, and the questions that still deserve attention. Subscribe now, because the next case may begin with evidence everyone thought had gone silent.